The foundation of United States governance rests upon the constitutional structure of separation of powers, explicitly detailed in Articles 1, 2, and 3, which delineate the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, respectively. Article 2 vests the executive power in the President, establishing inherent authority necessary for the functioning of that branch. This video will analyze two critical, frequently litigated boundaries of executive authority that are essential knowledge for the bar examination. First, we examine executive privilege, which concerns the inherent right to confidentiality within the executive branch. Second, we will explore the limits on congressional delegation, specifically the non-delegation doctrine, which constrains how much law-making authority Congress can transfer to executive agencies. We begin by framing executive privilege not as an explicit grant, but as an implied power vital for effective presidential decision-making and candid internal operations. We now define executive privilege. It is not explicitly enumerated in the Constitution, but rather is an implied power essential for the effective functioning of the executive branch. This privilege safeguards the confidentiality required for candid internal communications between the President and advisors, ensuring robust and honest deliberation necessary for sound decision-making. Its constitutional basis is inferred directly from the structure of the separation of powers itself, protecting the executive function from undue intrusion by the other branches. Historically, presidents have asserted confidentiality rights dating back to early administrations. Crucially, the Supreme Court has rejected the notion of an absolute privilege. Instead, executive privilege is recognized as a qualified privilege. This means that the president's need for confidentiality must be weighed and balanced against competing governmental interests, such as the need for evidence in a criminal investigation or the need for legislative oversight. This balancing act forms the core of modern executive privilege jurisprudence. The definitive modern articulation of this qualified privilege arrived in the landmark 1974 decision, United States v. Nixon. The facts centered on the Watergate investigation, where Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski subpoenaed audio tapes of presidential conversations recorded in the Oval Office. President Nixon asserted an absolute claim of executive privilege to withhold these tapes, arguing that confidentiality was paramount for the functioning of the presidency. The conflict was stark. The president's generalized need for confidentiality versus the judicial branch's demonstrated, specific need for evidence in a federal criminal trial. The Supreme Court unanimously ruled against the president. The court held that while executive privilege exists, it is not absolute, especially when balanced against the fundamental demands of due process and the fair administration of criminal justice. The generalized interest in confidentiality must yield when there is a specific demonstration of need for evidence in a criminal proceeding. This established the crucial principle: the privilege is at its weakest when weighed against the needs of the judicial process. Following the ruling in Nixon, executive privilege is recognized as qualified, meaning its strength depends heavily on the context of the assertion. We must examine the two primary areas where this balancing test is applied. First, as established, the privilege is weakest when weighed against the needs of criminal proceedings, where the judiciary demands evidence for due process. Second, the privilege is strongest when asserted in matters of national security and foreign affairs. Even here, however, the privilege is not absolute. Courts will review the claim, though they grant significant deference to the executive branch in these sensitive areas. Finally, it is important to distinguish executive privilege from the related, but broader, deliberative process privilege. This latter privilege is often asserted by agencies, not just the president, to shield pre-decisional policy discussions and internal recommendations from disclosure, protecting the agency's ability to formulate policy freely. We have just examined the boundaries of the President's inherent authority, specifically executive privilege. Now, we pivot to examine the limits on Congress's power to grant authority to the executive branch. This brings us to the non-delegation doctrine. This doctrine is fundamentally rooted in Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution, which explicitly vests all legislative powers in Congress. The core principle is that Congress cannot delegate its essential law-making function to an administrative agency. While this doctrine was historically significant, especially in challenging early New Deal legislation, it is rarely successfully invoked today to strike down a statute. Nevertheless, understanding the non-delegation doctrine remains crucial as it serves as a vital theoretical check against unchecked administrative overreach, ensuring that Congress retains ultimate control over policy creation. The central question under the non-delegation doctrine is whether Congress has provided an intelligible principle to guide the agency's exercise of the delegated authority. This principle serves as the constitutional yardstick ensuring Congress retains control over essential policy choices. Historically, the Supreme Court applied this test strictly. Early cases struck down statutes where Congress delegated authority using extremely broad mandates, finding that Congress had essentially abdicated its law-making role entirely. However, modern jurisprudence has dramatically relaxed this standard. Courts now interpret intelligible principle very broadly. In contemporary cases, Congress can delegate vast regulatory power using vague standards such as promoting the public interest, ensuring actions are just and reasonable, or maintaining fair and equitable practices. This broad interpretation means that while the doctrine technically exists, it rarely invalidates a delegation today, effectively permitting Congress to delegate significant policy choices to the executive branch. The previous discussion established that the intelligible principle test is now interpreted very broadly. This brings us to the practical reality of delegation in the modern administrative state. Despite the theoretical existence of the non-delegation doctrine, it has become largely moribund in practice. Why? Because the sheer complexity of modern regulatory schemes, covering everything from environmental standards to financial markets, demands specialized knowledge. Congress simply cannot write detailed rules for every contingency. Therefore, statutes must necessarily grant broad authority to expert agencies to fill in the technical details. This judicial acceptance of broad delegation is conceptually linked to agency deference doctrines, such as Chevron deference. While Chevron deals with statutory interpretation rather than delegation itself, it illustrates the judiciary's overarching willingness to uphold broad executive action when Congress has spoken, even if the statutory language is vague or silent on specific policy choices. This deference ensures the administrative state can function effectively. We have now examined two critical, yet distinct, constitutional boundaries governing the executive branch. First, executive privilege defines the inherent, necessary operational boundaries of the President, protecting the confidentiality required for candid decision-making against intrusion from the judiciary or Congress. Second, the non-delegation doctrine defines the constitutional limits on Congress's power, restricting how much operational authority it can grant to the executive branch. While one protects the President's internal sphere, and the other constrains Congress's reach, their ultimate purpose is identical: maintaining the constitutional balance of power. Both doctrines ensure that neither branch encroaches upon the essential functions reserved for the others. Understanding this dynamic tension, the inherent need for executive confidentiality versus the legislative requirement to retain lawmaking authority, is a key takeaway for success on the bar examination.